Hello, I'm Paul, and I'm going to introduce a very good friend of mine, Neil Thompson, to have a conversation about stuff to do with testing, life, the world and everything, over a pint.
Or two.
Or two. So it's a very informal thing, although we have a vague idea about what we're going to talk. But without further ado, Neil, do you want to just introduce yourself and just say who you are?
Well, I know Paul through software testing. We'll describe how that happened in a minute. I've had quite an unusual route into testing, I suspect. I used to be a programmer a long time ago, and then sort of graduated up to be a systems analyst, as they were called in those days. And then I spent quite a while maintaining and enhancing live systems and dealing with users. And when I came back to the UK after that, I joined a management consultancy. So I was called an information systems management consultant. And they did testing on some projects. And one of my first jobs was to apply the standard IEEE 829 and make it credible, intelligible and usable on a real project. So that's kind of how I went back into testing, having done it when I was a programmer years before.
So I think we met either in 1993 or 1994 at Eurostar, one or the other. I think I saw you speak at Eurostar in 93, but perhaps we didn't speak. We didn't talk to each other.
That is possible.
Because
your colleague Paul Hertzlich was there, so that was famous for inventing or publicising the double V or W model.
The W model, which still gets quoted from time to time. Much better than the V model, dare I say.
But yeah, certainly it was in Brussels where we discovered the Eurostar, the European part, because the first one was in London.
Yeah,
so we discovered Brussels and Belgian beer in quite a big way.
I was going to say Belgian beer figured prominently. So I think our history, is one aspect of our history, and in our careers has been conferences and stuff like that. And I vaguely remember the first Eurostar through a kind of beery haze, but in those days, it was only Eurostar, and then that was a spin-off from Star East, as was, in the States. And there was very few other events.
The first one was just called Star.
Well, exactly, indeed. Sorry, that's probably true, isn't it? Of course. And then there was the SIGIS, the BCS event that we both attended, I think, many times. But what's gone on with conferences? So what's the story there? I mean, how have they developed?
Eurostar used to be almost the highlight of my year, shall we say. There were certain people, some of whom are no longer in testing. I have no idea what happened to them, and some like Paul and several others are still around. But it really was a big thing, and we did it once a year, and maybe I was speaking, maybe I wasn't, and it was a huge social event. And the SIGIST was, I don't know how many times a year, but fast forward to now, and there seems to be multiple testing conferences you can go to every month, every week almost. There's something on, and it's completely transformed.
It is, yeah. And there were a small number. I remember ICS test was kind of run by SQS back in the day.
Yeah.
But the Swedish, the Swedes had their own SIGIS. The Dutch have had TestNet forever. But it seems like, yeah, you're quite right. There's small conferences that you can shake a stick at.
And of course the COVID and everything going on the internet and Zoom conferences, so that's changed things, and people have got used to doing online conferences now much more than they did before.
Yeah, and we both recall in around the turn of the millennium, we used to go to Eurostar and then think, hold on, some of these conversations sort of have to come to an end after the 3 or 4 days of Eurostar. Can't we carry them on? And so there was a notion of a thing called the retreat, which kind of got started in 2002. I missed the first one, but I think you went to the first. Do you recall?
I have actually been to all of them.
There's a sad person.
There's a risk that might stop this year, but we'll see. Yeah. I don't think I've missed one. Partly because if you miss one, you drop down the list. But fear of missing out.
There was a bit of a. You have to have a history to keep being invited. But essentially, it was a very personal event where about 10 to 12 of us got together, made our own agenda and just had it was like a discussion group more than anything else. Not too much PowerPoint, flip charts allowed, that kind of thing.
There was one occasion in Wales where there was, for some reason, a lot of PowerPoint and people reacted badly against it. But,
and I did have a bit of a row with Stuart Reid, an old friend of us both. I do recall in Wales, Glensevin I think it was.
Another big change, before I forget this, it started in England and it was always in a country house originally in Lincolnshire, and then we found most of the big country houses for rent were in the southwest. But some people from Europe, from Netherlands in particular, started to attend and come over, and it's gradually migrated, become more and more European. So in fact, in recent years, it's not been in England at all. It's been in Belgium or Netherlands or France.
So we went to one in the autumn last year. What number was that? Was that 22 or 23?
26.
26?
Yeah.
Grief. Okay.
There's one or two are missing. One or two people offered to organise one and then it didn't happen. So there were one or two dummies, but yeah.
Well, that's testing for you, isn't it?
I mean the conference, not the people.
Well, now the other thing that came across is we worked together on several projects over several years, and we both worked on an internet banking project for a major bank, needless to say. And I think it was the first or one of the very early kind of internet-based systems, particularly for banks in those days. Yeah. And I thought, there's an opportunity here to write a book. And very quickly, I thought, working with you, I thought, well, please help. I need some wise words from yourself. And we wrote a book, Risk-Based E-Business Testing. Do you want to talk about that experience a little bit?
Yes, I originally felt I'd kind of gatecrashed the project a bit, but it turns out that Paul did actually kind of invite me, but it wasn't obvious what the route in was. So I think it developed from me being a reviewer to, well, actually, I've been on this project day by day, and you've just been sort of managing it from afar. So why don't I write the Making It Happen section? So Paul was more expert in the technical side of the internet architectures at that time, so wrote all the not the introductory chapters, but the main meat of the book. But I'd been on the project, so how did we educate the client what we meant by risk? How did we actually run the meetings? How did we record the risks? What went wrong? I mean, one of the interesting things was that all the non-functional or parafunctional kinds of tests. To ask people to prioritise, how important is the usability over the security? Woo! Do we have to test both of those? Yeah. And then
well, you might think.
And what do you mean volume stress? So it suddenly it showed the client potentially how much testing we could do and how we didn't have time to do lots of it, which made the risk-based process obviously valid, because it forced people to make decisions.
I don't know if it was groundbreaking, but it seemed like we were doing things that other people in that bank had never done before. And I remember early on in the project that there was a conversation about operations, and then someone said, well, shouldn't we tell the operators about this, the operations team about this? And I said, why? Well, they only work from 8 till 8. And this is an internet system. It's a 24-hour-a-day system, and it was heavily unionised. So in those days, they were mostly mainframe users, almost exclusively mainframe users. So of course, no one told the ops guys they had to work 24 hours a day. So there was a kind of quite a lot going on.
Not individually, obviously. Yeah.
So, how did you get on with writing a book? How did you feel about that?
Well, yeah, it's the first time I'd done it. I actually prefer writing to sort of speaking and doing videos, to be honest. So writing I love. I was on projects at the time, I think, and so I was busy during the day, so I had to say a lot of it was written in the Shepparton Flock in Farnham in biro on paper, and then I'd edit it the next day, that was good. So Yeah, I think the worst part was the deadlines, because the publishers were very hard on the deadlines, so it just had to be done. And then Paul and I would have conversations about, what's your point there? So I'd say, well, my point is, you call that a point? So
what are you trying to say?
What are you really trying to say? So there were discussions
both ways.
Like
it wasn't just me complaining. We both.
It was interesting. It was a new experience. But obviously it worked. It's nice to have the book finished and see it on Amazon, etc.
It was quite substantial, and I have a copy here.
It was very expensive.
It was the crazy thing. The publisher, I think we're allowed to say this. The crazy thing was the publisher asked me very early on. Do you want it as a hardback or a paperback? And I said, well, what's the difference? And they said about $20. And okay. And then it turned out it wasn't a choice that I had. They just decided to do it as a hardback and charged a fortune. I think it was $70-something in the States and £50, which is way too much. So as a book, it's a collector's item. I think you can find it for about £3,000 now.
There was also a joke that the signed copies were more common than the unsigned copies.
That's always, yeah. Anyway, so it was great fun, I have to say, but I don't think I'd write a book as long as that. I think it was 130,000 words. Yeah. And for a technical book, that's pretty long. So
and it got the technical parts got out of date very quickly, of course. Well,
that's the challenge. No mention at all of mobile. No mention of services. Web service, that kind of stuff. I think, Neil, you had an opinion that the structure of the book might be not quite right for a modern reader, and clearly technology is out of date. But
it's not so much that the structure of the risk scoring and everything came from Paul. The emphasis in the book was on technical risks, largely that you get from an internet architecture and how to test that through sort of unit integration system level, if I might say those things. And there was also a mention that if you had requirements documented or a functional spec or paths through entity life histories or whatever, you could also prioritise those on a risk base. And although that was a small part of the book, I find since then that's at least half of the work on a real project doing that. Yeah. Another point also is that clients don't like the idea of a threshold. Low risk things aren't tested at all. It's better to say we'll test everything, but we'll go from high coverage to low coverage rather than a threshold where you don't do it. That kind of spooks people.
I think you're right. I mean, there's not many things that you can say, look, we're not going to test this at all. I mean, that doesn't...
Maybe some non-functional things you simply can't do, but maybe some of them...
Well, partly the practicalities of certain things you can't... And you've got to tackle things a different way and just reduce the risks by design or redundancy or some other mechanism. And it's not just about testing, that's the point. I mean, it's an input to a design or a redesign or refactoring kind of activity as well. Anyway, it was a good experience. Still, we use risk to drive most of what we do in testing. I don't know of another risk-based testing book. There's one or two academic-oriented books I know. And I don't know whether we've written the definitive version of risk-based testing or whether it's just not a topic that people think about.
So people still do talk about it. Some people tell me it's easy, and I really don't think it is easy. It's easy to do badly. Actually, there's another thing that's in the book that I think is very important now I come to think of it, and it's the famous Kerplunk model, trademark, which came from Paul completely rather than myself. But it's not just the risk, but it's balancing against the benefits. Yeah. If something has a particularly high benefit, say you have to get to market by a certain date because your competitor's going to beat you if you don't, that can almost override that can override a lot of risk because you simply have to be there. Yeah. So it's kind of sharpens your risk appetite, I suppose. And that is part of the book as well. So it's balancing risk against benefit, not just pure risk.
But I think my idea there was to have a matrix of all the risks running horizontally, and then the the benefits, the value, if you like, you're going to get out of certainly features or subsystems, whatever it is, whatever level. Some features, benefits are blocked by multiple risks. So the nice thing is you can say, well, if this feature is the most important thing we need to deliver, these are the 3 risks we need to concentrate on. Let's get them out of the way. And that was the idea of pulling the kaput stick out and things falling through. Yes. And I had some a terrible PowerPoint which showed that.
Other games are available.
Okay, exactly. Okay, so let's move on. I mean, we've both been in this game an awful long time. Well,
don't say how long.
Well, it's going to come out in the wash anyway. But I know. I think you are the best read tester I know, because of the stuff that you've referenced, and you never throw anything away, and you've got a house full of testing related books, papers, articles, everything.
I did want to have all the books. I don't buy them all anymore, I have to say, but in the early days, I think I called it industrial archaeology because, for example, various people were claiming to have invented the V model or the W model, so I was able to point back to Paul Hertzlich. But even better, people used to say, well, Glenford Meyer's Art of Software Testing
we have some books here.
Was the first software testing book. No, it wasn't. Myers wrote Software Reliability about 3 years before that. 76, yeah. And in 1971, Bill Hetzel ran a conference at Chapel Hill in Carolina, I think.
Those are the proceedings. Yeah. And this is
so some people say it's not a textbook, it's conference proceedings, which is true. But there's an X model in there, which is really just a V model with a couple of legs on it. So I have to emphasise I wasn't there at the time. I was looking backwards rather than forwards or sideways.
But you have to remember, I don't you, but you know the audience, is that in those days, in 1972-3, no such thing as mini computers, PCs. No one had even imagined those sort of things. It was all on mainframes. So of course it's very mainframe, large project, waterfall, dare I say, focused. Even so, a lot of the messages that we still promote as consultants and in conferences is test early, test often. Well, that message is at least 50 years old, and some folks still think testing happens at the end, whatever the end is. But it's remarkable when you read some of this stuff. I'm not trying to get too kind of, it was all better in the good old days. I don't mean that at all. But some of the writing that was done then, the research was done, was very on point, you know, and relevant today. So what do you think we still use out of those days? I mean, what are the things that have lasted and the things that have been cast aside?
Well, I think the V model and the W model are still actually used, but they're so unfashionable as to be toxic. So people use the same concepts but call them different things. So the agile testing quadrants, for example, use those sort of principles. I kind of distilled the V model down. The essentials I thought were there are always, or nearly always, layers of specification. So you start with an idea in somebody's head or two people's heads, and some stuff gets written down, and eventually you get to code, maybe through some complicated UML diagrams. So there's a hierarchy there. Secondly, all systems are integrated from parts in some way. So going up the right-hand side of the V model is a sequence of integration, unless it's 100% Big Bang. And thirdly, there are layers of stakeholders that kind of correspond, but both the people that are developing the system and the people that are going to use it as well. So you've got three hierarchies there. And then you've got a time dimension that you can do stuff as early as you can. So in an agile method, in effect, you're going up and down those, but you're doing it in an iterative way. So people don't like me saying that, but the concept is still there, but you haven't to call it a V model anymore.
Yeah. Well, the quadrant diagram was Brian Marrick's originally.
It was, yes, that's right.
Early 90s or late 80s, I can't remember
the date, but
Lisa Crispin popularised it, which is great. I had no problem there. But you look at the you Google the 4-quadrant model, for testing, and you'll get hundreds of references to images of everybody and his dog putting their own version in there. And yet, it doesn't tell you an awful lot. It's helpful, but it's testing 101. It's not. It doesn't transform your understanding of.
I'm not here to criticise the quadrants.
Well, I am. I've got no fear.
I quite like quadrants in other areas as well.
But my bugbear is the pyramid model. That is a direct, I would say, rip-off of the V model, which it's as good as replaces the right-hand side of the V model. It doesn't tell you anything that a V model practitioner 30 years ago wouldn't have told you, straight up and say, well, that's how it works. What's your problem? So one of the things I don't like about, but let me put it this way. One of the things that, if you've got a perspective going back 10, 20, 30 years, we tend to see things that we recognise from previous eras. And it's just been repackaged. The terminology might have changed. It's now the next big thing. And you know what? It's just not. It's just not. And I think more attention should be paid to some of the things that were written 10, 20, 30 or even longer, more years ago, that have value.
Well,
still.
I think that's where I like to think we can still help, because you can't expect people who've just started, they just come out of university or they've just joined the IT industry, you can't expect them to have the same interest in industrial archaeology as I do. So you can't expect them to go and read this stuff. So the challenge and the opportunity for us is to take that thinking but make it relevant and up to date, without telling people you already thought of this 20 years ago, because that's just not a good way of saying things.
And it sounds like two old men kind of moaning about the life of the world and everything. It's not like that. The way I would put it perhaps is the same old problems have been dogging the software development and testing industry for 50 years. And yes, the technology might change, but the underlying problem of integration, which is universal, endless, pervasive, it's everywhere. Ask someone to define integration testing and you'll get 25 different answers from 3 people, let alone a room full of people.
Well, it does depend on the architecture of the system.
Well, yes, but what I mean is like it's like it's not a stage. It starts from the second line of code you write. That has to be integrated with the first. And it doesn't stop even when the system's delivered into an environment, integrated with other systems, and you've got to integrate with a business process or other partners. I mean, integration has no start and no end. It's all pervasive. And so the problems have all been thought about for many, many years. And some of the solutions were defined many, many years ago. What else has occurs to you that would be useful if people just take a little look?
I mentioned that I wasn't against quadrants, so something I'd like to use, it's not strictly speaking testing, but if you're on a project or any kind of situation, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats model. Years ago, somebody told me about Goldratt's theory of constraints. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I ended up spending a few years writing a trilogy on the subject. And then that developed, that thought, well, that's actually part of systems thinking. And systems thinking got very trendy. There's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, again, a hierarchy. So there are lots of structures that are applicable beyond testing, in human relationships, in science, whatever. But I just found them interesting, and I think they're still usable. And nowadays, with so much emphasis on fast iteration and everything being automated, I'd like to see, well, where's the thinking behind that automation? You've got a long list of green tests that have all passed. Well, how good are the tests? What was the thinking that went into structuring those tests? So there's a whole bunch of techniques that are useful in making those kind of decisions.
So I would say they're all models of one type or another.
Yes.
So I think that's a reasonable thing to say. And models are applicable to testing, and it's universal, in that respect. But also how we make progress in life, is based on our perceptions, and our perceptions are models of our experience in the world, life, the world, and everything. So I would really encourage people who are just starting out to look a little bit more closely at the concepts of models, what models are, and if you like, the most famous ones. I mean, even if you don't go into the level of detail that you could do, Goldratt, systems thinking, Maslow, complexity, value flow scorecards. These are your buzzwords rather than mine.
Yeah.
But they all have value.
I claim to have invented the value flow scorecard as such, but it was built on ideas from Crosby's views of quality, Isabel Evans, I have to name check, and Mike Smith did some inputs to that, so I came up with the snappy name. But if you Google it, you still get my stuff at the top.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, it is kind of fashionable to talk about value, maybe as a substitute for the word quality. Let's not go there. But value is everything. But then how do you relate value to everything else in your context? It's a tough thing to do. But that thinking has been done. Yeah, that's the point,
Well, the scorecard has the views of quality. So how well do you process your inputs? How are you meeting time and budgetary constraints? How good is your process, or what do you think the process needs to be? Do you have to follow some standard process? What's the product quality in terms of bugs? What does the customer think about it? What do the users think about it? As the users aren't necessarily the person that's paying the bill. Infrastructure, improvement. So there's a whole series of quite distinct ways of what good looks like to different people.
But it's like, dare I say, is it Weltanschauung? You speak German, don't you? Which is the world.
No ambition.
your worldview.
Yeah.
In effect, and it's like your view of the product in context. It's like a worldview. I mean, the system is its own little world, let's say, but it's a systems thinking approach, and so it's not just about mugging your way through difficult situations, meetings, problem solving, this, that and the other. There's a lot of thinking that's already been done in these areas that could be reused. And I think some of it needs to be lifted out of the vaults and dusted off and refreshed.
Couldn't even give it a new name.
Well, that's probably the way to make it popular and fashionable. You talked a little bit to me earlier about this other hierarchy, from data onwards. What do you have any views on that?
So it's a bit like Maslow, but it's particularly so Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Probably not everybody knows about it, but humans initially the most basic needs are water, and then above that food. Probably next is shelter. And it goes all the way up to sort of sexual attraction, and eventually at the top you get sort of something called transcendence, which is kind of whatever you want it to be. Now the data thing, it's relevant to big data because in the old days databases were very structured. You had floating point numbers or strings or whatever. Everything was in its right place, and with big data you've got more amorphous or multi-format data, and it's big. So there are ways of adding value to it to be information so that people can actually make some sense of it. And then the next step up is knowledge. So you've got the information, but are you able to use it in a repeatable way at the right time? And then wisdom is, are you making the right decisions as a result of all that? And again, it's a concept that's usable all over the place.
So I've always thought that the purpose of testing was to gather information.
Yes.
For typically other people to make decisions.
So is it good information?
Yeah. So where does that information fit in your hierarchy? Is it what you call information, or is it knowledge, or where do we fit in this hierarchy of needs?
It's not a rigid system. So if you Google it, you'll find half a dozen different representations of it. So it's not a fixed thing. It doesn't have to be exact. But information is data that you can sort of make some use of, and knowledge is more making use of it on a sustainable basis.
And we're all being marketed with respect to machine learning and AI, and the whole ChatGPT thing seemed to be taking off like Google took off 20 years or whatever, how many years ago it was, as a replacement for Google almost, in that it doesn't just give you links to information, it gives you the answer to the question you ask. I mean, how does that fit in our world, do you think? Have you got any views on that? Or?
Well, it's an opportunity for testers. But it's really quite striking how it's making leaps forward, because there's a huge history of AI, of course, as people know. So it's been through various winters, and it's sometimes been like nuclear fusion. It's always 20 or 30 years off. But what's happening now is that it's just taking off, and I don't know if any testers are involved. So there are there are numerous articles about the data bias thing and how the AI appears to be biased, and then people say, well, that's because we fed it the last 50 years worth of real data, and people have been biased for the last 50 years.
Yeah. And the world is changing, isn't it?
Yeah, and the world is changing. So and they're non-deterministic as well. So there's a huge opportunity for testers to try and sort of police this in some way. That's the wrong word, but I suspect we're not being invited in. So how can we break into that?
So in some ways, nothing has changed, and the testers are latecomers to the party. Do you think we're still latecomers to the party? That is AI and machine learning.
Well, for that, I think we are.
Yeah.
I think I've been lucky in my career because most of the projects I've done, I've been involved quite early. So worked for Enlightened project managers. So we were not involved just at the end. We were involved all the way through. But but if the technology is moving so fast that only the experts can understand it, then an outsider will never be as valuable as somebody who's just done a PhD in it.
Well, with this ChatGPT that seems to be taking over the world right now, that will all change, I'm sure. A chap called Jason Arbon, a guy with a testing background in the US, put the ISTQB, I think it was the foundation exam, through ChatGPT, and it passed. And other blogs I've seen recently is that ChatGPT has passed a law exam, it's passed a medical exam, and it's passed an MBA exam. I mean, do you really think we'll be using ChatGPT or something like it to run our businesses? Where does this end? You know,
I honestly don't know. I mean, I haven't read all of these stories, but there are plenty of stories where people are showing ChatGPT to be not very good at certain things. So I think you were saying earlier on, it's very sensitive to the questions you ask.
Yeah, if
and
you ask,
the way you ask them.
Yeah, if you ask a contextual question, you'll get, rather than a context-free question, I'm not sure they're opposites, but whatever. A context-free question might be easy to answer for it. But it's all based on knowledge I think it gets from the internet, and we all know the internet has some good points and some terrible points. So I think the jury's out on whether it will replace testers. I don't think it will ever will. But
no, it needs testers to test it. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But there's a challenge for us to be accepted as having something to contribute.
I mean, there's stuff that's going on now, and it's an endless list of. The historical thing is testers have been involved late and had new architectures, new technologies, new functionality that we've never encountered before, dumped on us, and then we have to go and test them. And the stuff that's going on now, with the metaverse, which may or may not be the answer to all our ills, AI, IoT, big data, microservices, systems of systems have always been there and never gone away. I mean, how do we deal with this? We've always had this kind of problem. I mean, what's your experience of how we deal with this new stuff?
Well, some of it is fashion. So to be honest, some of it will come and go, and some of it I don't understand. I was listening to a radio program this morning about e-commerce and how a lot of direct selling was being done on TikTok, but the clips were of people squealing and making silly noises, and the only products they talked about were fashion items and makeup. So I just wasn't able to relate to it, I'm afraid. So what other examples there are, I'm sure there are other examples.
I think there's examples now, or prototypes, let's call them, of services where you can choose a dress or suit on a website and have basically your details on their system, and it will dress you in the suit. And you think, that's not that clever. But it's almost like, well, you don't need to go to a shop anymore. You can see yourself in this dress. You don't have to try it on because it's there. And I'm not sure that's really...
A lot of people still do want to go to shops.
There's a ritual, isn't there? There's a ceremony kind of thing going
on. And there's an environmental thing as well. So that it became very common for people to buy stuff by mail order and wear it for a party or something and then send it back. So there's all this cardboard packaging flying around, being driven by diesel and petrol engines. It doesn't seem...
Or drones.
It doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't seem very sustainable.
Yeah. So inevitably and inexorably, the complexity of the systems we test grows year by year, decade by decade. And this notion of systems can be... I've always used the same examples. It could be an electric toothbrush or it could be an aircraft carrier, which is an enormous system of systems, many hundreds of systems all collaborating. I mean, what's your view on the idea of this concept of systems getting out of hand almost and the complexity being beyond anybody to understand and to test? And what's your view on that?
Well, it's scary. Things like microservices, but also sort of fragmentation. For example, social media interfacing to payment systems, whatever. So the complexity is greater, but also it's more asynchronous. So you've got data relationships that are being caught up after the event, and you don't know whether that's going to be 5 seconds later or 5 minutes or 5 hours, because they're kind of prioritized. So what the company thinks people are most interested in, it'll update first, and I don't know that somebody's accepted your friend request might be sort of kicked into the long grass for a day or something, and so there's a judgment on what's important, but how to test it when it's kind of not deterministic and you don't know when the dates the delays are going to be is a huge challenge.
And the whole idea of the metaverse. It requires huge bandwidth to work, megabytes per second moving along our networks rather than
what's
1200 bits per second.
What's it actually for? What's the point of the...
Indeed. But I think that the challenge is, to me, it's the unknown. It's the unknown connections that you might know what your system connects to, but do you know what these other systems, what they connect to? And you can be sat in a bar having a conversation about holidays, and then a moment later you're getting messages from some system you've never used before, inviting you to go on holiday in Turkey, because Turkey came up in the conversation because there's been a terrible earthquake there. And you think, well, how did they put 2 and 2 together to make 3? And this isn't new, but it's going in one direction. It's only getting more complex and more interconnected and more entwined. And the whole privacy and the security aspects, they seem to grow every year in complexity.
And then there's the Internet of Things, of course, which we were talking about earlier, but just not right now. So again, you get unexpected behaviour potentially.
Absolutely. I mean, we don't know.
Large-scale connectivity, things happen that you didn't expect. Kind of emergent things.
And we're putting software in systems that very definitely have physical reality, but they are not deterministic. So the whole self-driving car challenge is, it might have been solved for in a very well-organised American city with streets and avenues running north and south and so on, north and northwest and so on. But it put that same system, that same driverless car in Bangalore in India, and I don't think you would have a successful outcome there. I'm kind of a bit depressed by that. But on the other hand, it's obviously exciting for the next generation of people. I mean, what are your feelings on this?
Well, people they've got arguments that statistically these things are going to be safer because humans are so emotional and it's some extremely bad driving, and when you average it out, allegedly the self-driving cars are going to be safer.
Let's hope.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Honestly, I don't know.
I don't think we've got a lot to say on that. So I think it's a good time to draw it to a close. Neil, thanks so much, and
Thank
cheers.
You. Yeah, thank you for having me.
And to you, Very good health. Cheers. Sorry.